There are wounds that blades cannot make. There are scars that no healer's hand can mend. And there are women, quiet, overlooked, pushed to the edge of cliffs and left for dead, who carry entire kingdoms in their chests without anyone ever knowing. This is the story of one such woman. Her name was Simran, and the world would learn, far too late, that the daughters of healers do not break. They simply wait. Before we begin, if you're new here, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story reaches. I'll be reading every single one. The night Thorn brought his human woman home. A wolf howled somewhere deep in the thornwood, long, mournful, and wrong. The old wolves said later that the forest knew, that the trees bent away from the carriage road as it wound through the dark pines, as if the wood itself wished to close its eyes. But no one listened to old wolves. They rarely do until it is too late. Lord Thorn of Ashenvale had once been something worth admiring. That was the honest truth, painful as it sat. In his prime, he had stood among the great werewolf lords of the Northern Territories, broad-shouldered, silver-eyed, with the kind of stillness that predators wear like a second skin. He had been fierce in battle, loyal in council, and when he had loved with a violence that left no room for anything else. His wife, Tori, had been proof of that. She was pure blood, not merely in the technical sense, not simply a wolf born of wolf parents, but in the ancient, luminous sense that the elders spoke of in hushed voices. A bloodline that stretched back to the first moon, when the goddess herself had walked among the wolves and blessed a line of women with the gift of healing. Tori carried that gift like a second heartbeat, steady, sure, and warm enough to soften stones. She had a mouth that curved like a crescent moon and a laugh that could calm a panicked pack. She pressed wildflowers between the pages of books she'd already memorized. She sang to the river on mornings when she thought no one was listening, and she healed, not just bodies but things less tangible. Grief, anger, the particular exhaustion of men who had fought too long and forgotten why. She had healed Thorn once, too, back when he had been worth healing. Their daughter, Simran, was born on a winter night so cold the stars looked brittle. Tori had labored quietly, the way she did everything, with focused, private strength, and when they placed the child in her arms, she had looked down at that small, crinkled face and wept. "She has your eyes," Thorn said. "She has her own eyes," Tori corrected, gentle but firm. "She'll have to see her own world in them." It was the most prophetic thing she ever said, and she never got to know it. Simran was barely 3 months old when the Alpha Council summoned Lord Thorn. The meeting lasted 2 hours. He emerged stone-faced and said very little at the dinner table that night, carving his meat with the mechanical focus of a man who needed his hands to be doing something so his mind could be somewhere else. "Tell me," Tori said. He set down his knife. "There's an incident in the human territories. A rogue faction, wolves who've abandoned pack law, living among humans, causing exposure risks. They need someone with diplomatic standing and combat experience to handle it quietly." "How long?" 3 months, he said. "Perhaps 4. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she always did, deeply, without flinching, reading what lived beneath the surface of his words. "Come back to us," she said finally. "That's all I ask. Come back." He kissed her, held his daughter for a long time, breathing in the milk and wildflower scent of her, and then he left. 3 months became 6. 6 became a year. A year became 3. 3 became 15. The letters stopped after the second year. There had been explanations at first. The mission was more complex than anticipated. The rogues had deeper connections into human infrastructure. It required sustained presence. And Tori had believed them because she was not a suspicious woman. She was a faithful one. She tended Ashenvale in her husband's absence, raised their daughter, healed the sick who came to their gates, and kept the Lord's seat warm with the patient dignity of a woman who trusts. But even the most faithful women run out of letters to answer. Simran grew up in a house haunted by an absence. She was a quiet child, not unhappy, but watchful, with her father's silver eyes and her mother's steadiness. She learned to read in the library by candlelight. She learned to identify every herb in the thornwood by smell. She sat beside her mother during healings and watched those capable hands work, absorbing without being taught, understanding without being explained. She was 7 when she first healed something on her own. A sparrow had flown into a window and lay stunned on the courtyard stone. Simran crouched beside it, cupped it in both palms, and did what she had seen her mother do 100 times. She went still, went inside herself, and let the warmth move from her chest through her arms, through her hands, into the small, frightened body. The sparrow blinked, righted itself, flew. Torai, watching from the doorway, said nothing. She simply pressed her hand to her heart, looked up at the gray winter sky, and smiled. "You gave it to her?" she whispered. "Not to Thorn, not to anyone in particular, perhaps to the goddess herself. You gave it to her before you knew she'd need it. Simran would need it. God, she would need it." He came back on a Tuesday. There was no warning, no letter, no wolf messenger sent ahead to give them time to prepare. One moment the road through the thornwood was empty, and the next, a carriage was coming. Black lacquered, pulled by dark horses, crested with the Ashenvale sigil but trimmed in colors no one recognized. Simran was 15. She was in the garden, harvesting lavender, her dark hair loose and her hands purple-stained and her attention wholly absorbed in the work. She heard the horses and straightened, shielding her eyes against the afternoon sun. The carriage stopped. Lord Thorn stepped out. She nearly didn't know him. 15 years had made him heavier through the jaw and narrower in the eyes. The silver in his hair was not the dignified kind but the sudden kind, the gray that comes not from age but from choices. He looked at Simran with an expression that moved through recognition, something that might have been guilt, and then settled into something harder and more comfortable. Authority. Simran. He said her name like it was a fact he'd read in a file, not a child he'd held. "Father," she said carefully. He turned back to the carriage and extended his hand. The woman who stepped out was human. That was immediately apparent. The wolves of Ashenvale had a sensory vocabulary far beyond what eyes could offer, and everything about this woman registered as other. Her scent, her heartbeat, the absence of that particular electric quality that werewolf blood carried. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way of a woman who has worked at it. Dark-eyed, full-lipped, wearing traveling clothes that were expensive without advertising it. She took Lord Thorn's hand and looked around the estate with an expression of assessment. Then the second person stepped out of the carriage. She was a girl, perhaps 12 or 13, all angles and coloring like her mother, but with Lord Thorn's particular set to the jaw. She clutched a small velvet bag to her chest and looked at Simran with the wariness of a cat in an unfamiliar room. "This is Marian," Lord Thorn said, indicating the woman, "and her daughter Helen. They will be staying." Simran looked at her father. "Staying," she repeated, "in the manor." He met her eyes and something passed between them. Something that had no name but that Simran felt in her stomach like cold water. Prepare the east wing. That night, Tori, who had been resting. She had not been well in recent months. A strange wasting tiredness that the healers in the village could not explain, heard the carriage. Simran helped her down the stairs and watched her mother look at her husband and his human woman with the quiet, devastating composure of someone who has understood a terrible thing but refuses to perform their grief for anyone's benefit. Thorn did not meet his wife's eyes. He did not have the courage to. Torai died 3 weeks later. It was called mysterious, the healer's unexplained illness that had no wound and no poison any wolf physician could identify, and perhaps it was. Perhaps her body simply understood what her heart would not accept and chose the mercy of ending. Perhaps the goddess called her home because she could see what was coming and loved Tori too much to let her live through it. Or perhaps there were things in the manner of her dying that someone worked very hard to ensure no one examined too closely. No one examined too closely. Lord Thorne buried his pure-blood wife on a gray morning with the brisk efficiency of a man filing paperwork. Marion stood at his side in black that fit too well for traveling clothes. Helen stood slightly behind, watching Simran from across the grave with those careful, calculating eyes. Simran stood at her mother's grave until the last mourner had gone and the light had failed, and then she stood there some more. She did not cry, or rather, she cried so completely and so privately that by the time she was done, she had put the grief somewhere deep and locked it there and stood up straighter. She was 15 years old. She went home to a house that no longer felt like one. It did not happen all at once. Cruelty rarely does. It understands instinctively that the gradual variety is far more effective, that people can resist a blow but struggle to pinpoint the moment water began cutting through stone. Marion was not monstrous. That was almost the worst of it. She was simply displacing, methodically and without drama. Tori's rooms refurnished, Tori's books relocated, Tori's garden redesigned with plants Marion found more aesthetically pleasing. One thing at a time. Nothing dramatic enough to point at and call what it was. But there were smaller things. Simran's portion at meals, slightly reduced. Simran's requests, slightly delayed. Simran's presence in rooms, slightly unwelcome in ways no one articulated but everyone understood. The servants, who had loved Tori, who had watched Simran grow, began to look away when she passed. It was not that they stopped caring. It was that they had new masters and they needed to keep their positions, and sometimes love is a luxury that people cannot afford. Helen learned quickly. She was clever, Helen, in the particular way of those who have grown up watching which way the power blows and positioning themselves accordingly. She had watched her mother navigate the world from the disadvantaged position of a human woman in love with a werewolf lord, and she had learned. You take what you can, when you can, by whatever means are available. You do not feel guilty about it. Guilt is for people with alternatives. She borrowed Simran's things without asking and returned them damaged or not at all. She told Lord Thorne small, engineered stories, a missing silver brooch that had been in the Ashenvale family for generations, a torn tapestry, a broken household ledger, in which Simran was always the common factor, always slightly to blame, always slightly careless or slightly dishonest. Lord Thorne, who had already lost the habit of looking at his firstborn daughter clearly, found it easier to believe Marion and Helen than to believe Simran. It required less of him. She's trouble, Marion told him one evening, when she thought Simran was out of earshot. She has her mother's stubborn streak. And she's been through the household stores again. I'm certain of it. The girl doesn't steal, Thorne said. But it was the voice of a man already halfway convinced, already reaching for the easier thing. I'm not saying she means harm, Marion replied, with the practiced reasonableness of a woman who means great harm. I'm saying she's unsettled. Grief does things to children. Perhaps she needs structure. The structure they gave Simran was less a room and more a corner. She survived it the way her mother had survived things, by going inward, tending her own flame carefully, keeping it burning in the wind. She worked. She healed the animals that wandered injured to the estate gates. She kept a journal in a cipher only she knew and wrote everything in it. Everything she noticed, everything she felt, every injustice catalogued not for revenge but for clarity. This is what is happening, the journal said. I see it. I know it. I am not imagining it. She was not imagining it. She was also utterly alone. Until the night they took her to the cliff. The room they had given her at Ashenvale was the second best room in the East Wing, and Helen had spent her first 3 weeks cataloging exactly what that meant. It meant the window faced east, which was good morning light which she preferred. It meant the wardrobe was slightly smaller than the one in the first best room, which Simran occupied. It meant the floorboards near the door creaked, which was useful in a house where information was a resource and footsteps were information. It meant she was here, which was, her mother reminded her frequently. Everything. Everything compared to where they had been. Helen had been 12 when she understood what her mother was. Not in the pejorative sense. Not the villain's origin story sense, the thunderclap of revelation that stories like to insert at the moment of corruption. She had simply been 12, watching her mother across the small kitchen table of the small house in the human city where they had lived for as long as Helen could remember, and had understood. Her mother was afraid. Specifically and constantly, and with the particular quiet efficiency of someone who has converted fear into fuel. Marion was afraid of being without resources, money, connections, protection, the specific shelter that came from proximity to power. She had been without those things once, before Helen was born, and the experience had carved something out of her that she had replaced with calculation. Helen understood this. She was not her mother, but she was her mother's daughter. She lay in the second-best room and looked at the east-facing window and thought about Simran, who had grown up in this house with a mother who sang to rivers and healed broken things and who was, even dead, more present in this manner than Marion had ever been in any room she'd occupied. Helen was not jealous of Simran. This was harder to admit, and she admitted it only in the dark, only to herself, only as quickly as possible before covering it back up. Envious of who Simran was, which was different. Jealousy wanted the other person's things. Envy wanted to be the thing the other person was, and had no idea how to begin. Simran did not calculate. That was the strangest part, the most alien part. She moved through the world as if she believed it owed her the same courtesy she extended to it, and when it didn't pay, when it took as it always took, as it had taken and taken from her, she simply continued. Not naively, not blindly. She saw everything. Helen had watched carefully enough to be certain of that. Simran saw everything and was not destroyed by it, and Helen, who had also seen everything and was using it for survival, could not understand how that was possible. She decided it was a kind of stupidity, a beautiful, functional stupidity, an inability to armor up. She decided this and almost believed it. She reached for the silver brooch on her bedside table, the one she had taken from the box under Simran's bed and placed in Simran's drawer, and reported to Lord Thorne with the expression of a woman regretfully confirming a suspicion. She held it in the dark. She thought about the way Simran had stood in the hall that day, perfectly still, perfectly clear-eyed, and said, "I did not take it." Not pleading, not performing innocence, just stating a fact, with the complete calm of someone who knew what was true and had decided the truth was worth saying even knowing it would not be believed. Helen put the brooch in her pocket. She told herself she would put it back. She did not put it back. But she held onto the memory of Simran's face saying, "I did not take it," and she kept it somewhere, and she did not examine why. The accusation was a pearl necklace. Her mother's pearl necklace, a triple strand of luminous orbs that Tori had worn on her wedding day, and that had been passed to her by her own mother, and that Simran had kept in a wooden box under her bed because it was one of the few things of her mother's that Marion hadn't claimed. Marion claimed it now, or rather, she claimed it was missing and then found it, with theatrical distress, in a drawer in Simran's room, where she had placed it. The trial, if you could call it that, lasted 20 minutes. Lord Thorne presided with the exhausted resignation of a man who had long ago chosen the wrong life and had to keep living it. Marion performed grief. Helen watched with bright, avid eyes. Simran was 17 years old and she stood in the center of the hall where her mother had once danced, and she said, "I did not take it," with the calm of someone who has already accepted that the truth is not in this room. The point. "The evidence," Thorne began, "is in my room because someone put it there," she said. "You know that, Father." He looked at his hands. He could not look at her. That was all the answer she needed, and it was the worst answer she had ever received. Marion suggested the cliff with the manner of someone proposing a minor administrative solution. In the old pack law, ancient, barbaric, mostly abandoned, a thief who shamed the household could be cast out at the boundary. The Ashenvale estate bordered the Greymount cliffs. The symbolism was not subtle. "You cannot be serious," Simran said. Lord Thorne finally looked at her. She searched his face for the man who had held her as an infant and felt the warmth of her and chosen the name she would carry forever. She found only a stranger, tired and ashamed and unable to afford the cost of choosing her. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it, and he did it anyway. It was midnight when they walked her to the cliff's edge. The moon was high and enormous, full and white and indifferent. Below, the Greymount Valley was a darkness textured by wind, the distant sound of the river completely swallowed by the sound of her own breathing and the crunch of boots on stone. Marian had brought a lantern. Helen had come too, her face arranged in an expression of reluctant participation, though her eyes were bright. "It's just the boundary," Marian said, as if this were reasonable. "Cast out. She'll find her way." From a cliff edge, at midnight, Simran stood at the precipice and looked down into the dark and thought of her mother, who had stood on no cliff but had been pushed off the edge of her own life just as thoroughly and just as quietly. She thought, "I will not give them the satisfaction of being afraid." She was afraid, but she did not give them the satisfaction. She turned to face them. "This will not end well for you," she said, and her voice was so level, so entirely without melodrama, that Marian's composed expression flickered for just a moment. "I am telling you this not as a threat, as a fact. Remember that I told you." Lord Thorne's jaw worked. Helen looked away. Marian gestured toward the drop. And from the darkness behind them, from the tree line, from the road, from the direction of the Eastern Territories where no one had been looking because they had all been looking at the girl on the cliff, came a sound. Hoofbeats, many of them, and then a voice, carrying across the cliff top with the particular authority of a man entirely accustomed to being the most powerful thing in any given space. "Step away from her." He was not what stories had prepared her for. The stories said the Alpha King and the mind furnished a particular image. Enormous, savage, armored, with the presence of a thunderstorm and a face arranged in permanent displeasure. The stories were not technically wrong. He was tall enough that the massive black stallion he rode looked proportionate, and the 6 wolves that rode with him carried weapons that were clearly not decorative, and his expression was something that most people would classify as displeasure. But he was also simply a man, 24 years old. She would learn later. Black-haired, dark-eyed in a way that suggested not cruelty but depth. The eyes of someone who had seen many things and processed most of them privately. A jaw that looked like it had been designed to be set. He wore traveling clothes, not armor, which meant he had not come to her cliff specifically. Had simply been near it, passing through the outer territories of his kingdom on some business of his own. He took in the scene with the speed of a predator cataloging threat. The girl at the cliff's edge, the woman with the lantern, the older lord whose body language was performing innocence badly, the other girl in the background. His dark eyes moved to Simran. She met them without flinching. Something happened in his face, brief, involuntary. She couldn't name it. "Lord Thorne of Ashenvale," he said, still not raising his voice, which was somehow more frightening than shouting. "Do you want to explain to me what you're doing at the Greymount Edge at midnight with your daughter?" "My king." Thorne's voice had become very small. "This is a household matter. Everything in my kingdom is my matter." Kyle dismounted. He walked, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the absolute certainty of a man who has never in his adult life been anywhere he was not authorized to be, to Simran's side. He positioned himself between her and the cliff's edge not with a gesture but simply with his body, placing himself where the drop was. She noticed that. She noticed the deliberateness of it. "Are you hurt?" he asked her, and his voice was different in this register. Still low, but not public. A real question asked with real attention. "No," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, again that involuntary flicker, and then he turned back to Lord Thorne. What happened next was brief and entirely definitive. The Alpha King of the Werewolf territories did not shout. He did not make threats. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes in the measured, administrative tone of a man closing a chapter, and in those 4 minutes he made clear that the girl was leaving with him, that Lord Thorne was being formally cited for conduct unbecoming, and that if any of them attempted to follow or interfere or communicate with the girl without her explicit consent, The consequences would escalate in proportion to the attempt. Then he turned to Simran. "Will you come? Not come. Not, you're coming." Not the imperious command he could have issued, and that she would have had very little power to refuse. "Will you come?" She looked at the cliff behind him. She looked at her father, who was looking at his boots. She looked at Marian's lantern and Helen's bright eyes and the house she had grown up in and the ghost of her mother hovering over all of it like a smell. "Yes," she said. She walked away from the cliff without looking back. This was, in the tradition of people who survive terrible things by choosing the direction of their movement, perhaps the bravest thing she had ever done. It would not remain the bravest thing she ever did for long. The Alpha King's palace was called the Northern Reach, and it was everything the name suggested. Granite-built, severely roofed, set against the Ashgar Mountains like something the mountains had grown rather than something humans had placed there. It was not beautiful in the way that things decorated for beauty are beautiful. It was beautiful the way a wolf is beautiful, functional, inevitable, complete. Simran arrived at dawn with dust on her boots and her mother's face in her chest and absolutely nothing else. Kyle's housekeeper, a brisk woman named Marin who smelled of cedar and spoke in complete, efficient sentences, brought her to a room that was larger than the entire floor of the Ashenvale manor she had been permitted to inhabit, and showed her the bath and the wardrobe with the matter-of-fact generosity of someone who considers comfort a logistical problem rather than a gift and therefore has no awkwardness about providing it. "The king will see you at dinner if you're feeling up to it," Marin said. "If you're not, meals will be brought here. There's no obligation." Simran sat on the edge of the enormous bed and looked at her hands, still faintly lavender-stained from the garden, and felt the strangeness of being safe so acutely that it almost hurt. "Thank you," she said. Marin looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. "No need," she said, and left. Dinner was in a small room, not the great hall, a consideration Simran realized that Kyle had made without announcing it. 6 people at a table that could hold 40 would have felt performative. 6 people in a private dining room felt like something else. He was already seated when she arrived. He stood when she entered, automatically, with the reflex of ingrained courtesy, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment, recalibrating her own understanding of him. He was, she thought, a man who had been raised correctly and then had the rest of it stripped away by the particular education of power. There were still manners underneath the authority. They surfaced sometimes unbidden. "You look better," he said, which was probably a diplomatic way of saying that Dawn, exhausted and dusty, had been a concerning baseline. "I feel better," she said, which was true. Sleep and a bath had done the straightforward work of straightforward remedies. She sat across from him, and they ate, and something happened that surprised her. They talked. Not about the cliff or her father or the complicated machinery of how she had come to be there. About smaller things, the Thornwood's eastern logging concerns, which she knew surprisingly well from years of quietly managing the estate her father neglected. The history of the Greymount territory. A dispute between 2 neighboring packlords that he described with a dry brevity that was, she recognized with surprise, actually funny. She laughed. He looked slightly startled, as if this had not been a calculated effect and he was experiencing the unaccustomed sensation of having accidentally been amusing. Oh, she thought. He's uncertain. Somewhere in there. She filed this away. They were not, in those first weeks, in love. They were not even particularly close. But there was something, the particular comfort that comes from 2 people who are accustomed to performing for others, finally finding themselves in a space where the performance is not required. They were both, she came to understand, lonely in the specific way of people surrounded by attention without being truly seen, and the novelty of the alternative was startling. She walked his grounds in the mornings and learned the palace's rhythms. She visited the pack healers and asked questions and shared knowledge and was treated, to her lasting private astonishment, as someone whose knowledge was worth having. She helped in the infirmary on Wednesdays. She read in the library on other days and left notes in the margins of books, careful, penciled notes in her small handwriting. And once she came in to find a note responding to one of hers, also in pencil, also small. She knew his handwriting by then. She sat very still for a long moment looking at that note, and then she wrote back. This was, in its quiet way, a courtship, though neither of them would have called it that. Helen came to the Northern Reach as a messenger, Lord Thorne's formal request for an audience with the Alpha King, delivered by the Lord's daughter as a sign of courtesy, and arrived with her mother's talent for walking into a room and immediately understanding its architecture of power. She is 16 now. The angles of her childhood had resolved into something sharp and arresting. She watched Simran move through the palace. Easy in the corridors, familiar in the kitchens, known by the guards by name and catalogued everything. She has made herself at home, Helen thought. She has made herself necessary. She watched the Alpha King watch Simran across the dinner table that night, watched the way his attention always found her, the slight lean in her direction when she spoke, the involuntary curve at the edge of his mouth when she said something unexpectedly dry, and understood that her father's mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectation. The king likes her, Helen thought. And then, the king would like anyone who was kind to him, probably, because he is powerful and lonely and has never in his life had someone who wasn't afraid of him. And then, I am not afraid of him. She smiled at the Alpha King across the table. He smiled back, politely, with the courtesy he extended to everyone. Helen filed this away. She had been there 2 days when it happened. Kyle had been reviewing Border Patrol reports in his study, late in the evening, as he often was, when the message arrived from the Northern Watch. A rogue pack moving fast, attempting to breach the Eastern Mountain Pass. He rode out within the hour with his guard. He came back 3 days later, barely making it through the palace gates before his body made the accounting of damage that adrenaline had been covering. A blade wound along his left side, deep and long, from a wolf blade that had been treated with something. A compound the palace physicians couldn't immediately identify, something that made the wound heat and the fever rise and the patient's already taxed system spiral into the particular vicious physics of magical poisoning. By the time Simran heard the commotion and came down from her room, they were carrying the Alpha King on a stretcher. She pushed through the gathered crowd to the physician's corridor. Marin caught her arm. The physicians. I know, Simran said. I've been watching this for 2 days. The heat coming off him even from a distance was wrong. She'd smelled the specific quality of wrongness in the air and been trying to identify it. It's a suppression poison. It's suppressing the body's own healing mechanisms. The more his body tries to repair the wound, the harder the poison suppresses it. The physician's compounds won't work because they're all designed to boost natural healing. You need to go around the poison, bypass it entirely. Marin looked at her with sharp, recalibrating eyes. You know how. Simran looked at the door to the physician's room. Beyond it, the king was unconscious, his body conducting a war his healers couldn't see the whole battlefield of. My mother knew how, she said. She taught me. Let me in. She barely left the room. The physicians were skeptical, then reluctant. Then, by the end of the first day, watching her hands work with a precision and sureness that was not educated in any school they recognized. Quietly awed. What Simran did was not what medicine did. It was older than medicine. It was the laying of one life force alongside another and using the warmth of one to hold open the door that the poison was trying to close. She sat beside him in the blue hours and placed her hands on his chest and breathed with him. Slow, deliberate, riding his labored rhythm and gently, incrementally, easing it towards something more sustainable. She didn't sleep much. She ate what Marin brought without interrupting her focus. The palace around her became a kind of weather. She was aware of it without being inside it. On the second day she thought, he is stronger than he knows. Even in unconsciousness, even fighting a suppression that was designed to systematically dismantle his body's defenses, he was reaching some elemental part of him that had nothing to do with consciousness and everything to do with will. She had never felt anything quite like it. It was like trying to support a falling mountain and discovering the mountain was, quietly, fighting to stand itself. On the fourth day she felt the poison begin, not to retreat exactly but to stabilize. The suppression stopped advancing. This was the most dangerous moment. The place where a healer could mistake stasis for progress and relax her focus, at which point the poison would make its final move. She did not relax. On the 6th day, one of the junior guards, a young man named Petcher who'd been posted at the door and had begun bringing her tea without being asked, said quietly, "You know you could sleep, my lady. We'd wake you if—" "I know," she said. She did not sleep. On the 7th morning, she felt the shift. Not in his breathing, not in his temperature, but in whatever she'd learned to read through her hands, that vitality signal her mother had taught her to sense. It flickered, steadied, and then, like a flame in a room that has finally been sheltered from the wind, it held. She sat back. I looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "It's done," she thought. "He's through the worst of it." She needed clean clothes. She needed to wash her face. She needed, possibly, to cry somewhere private, because 7 days of holding herself together at considerable structural cost had left certain things pressurized. "Watch him," she said to Peter. "He may wake at any point. When he does, tell him to rest. Don't let anyone overwhelm him with information immediately." Petcher nodded with the grave seriousness of a young man being trusted with something important. Simran went upstairs. She was gone perhaps 20 minutes. Helen was in the room when Kyle opened his eyes. She had come, as instructed, to deliver Lord Thorne's formal message. 3 days ago now, though the palace had been, understandably, too occupied with the king's condition to attend to it. She had waited with the contained patience of a plant that has found a suitable wall to grow against, attending dinners, making herself gently useful, asking after the king's condition with exactly calibrated concern. Petcher had stepped out, briefly, to get water for when the king woke, and in those few minutes, Kyle's eyes had opened. Helen was by his side before his vision had fully cleared. She took his hand. His eyes found her face. "You're safe," she said, warmly, with enormous conviction. "You're going to be all right." He looked at her, blurred, disoriented, surfacing from 7 days of fevered unconsciousness with all the confusion that entails. "Who?" "I've been here," she said, and her voice was low and close and certain. "I've been with you the whole time." She squeezed his hand. "Don't worry. I didn't leave you." He looked around the room, at the physician's tools, the window that showed an afternoon sky, his own hands. 7 days, she said softly. "You've been unconscious for 7 days. I've been right here." Petcher returned with the water. Kyle looked at Petcher. "She's right, my lord," Petcher said carefully. "She was in the room, Lady Helen. I mean, she's been coming in often." He was not lying. He had seen Helen in the room. He had seen Simran in the room. He was a 20-year-old guard who had been told to keep watch and had not entirely understood what he was watching, and in the blurred gap of the king's first moments of consciousness, Petcher made the mistake of many bystanders. He said the true thing without the full true thing. He had not seen what Helen was doing in the room, which was mostly sitting in the good chair near the fire, taking notes on correspondence she had no business having, and leaving when she grew bored. He had not thought to specify this. Helen, reading his hesitation, filled it. "I know I'm only a guest here," she said to the king, with a humility that was nearly perfect. "I didn't do much. I couldn't stand to think of you alone in here." Kyle looked at her hand. He was disoriented and grateful and very, very human in this moment, which is to say he was susceptible to precisely the story that someone with something to gain was telling him. "Simran," he said, her name coming up from somewhere, remembered. Helen's expression underwent a transition so controlled it would have impressed a veteran actress. Something sad, something forgiving. "She was in and out," she said gently. "She has a lot to attend to, you know how she is." She checked in, of course, but she let the sentence trail off. Let the ellipsis do its work. This is the art of the strategic lie. Not what you say, but what you allow the listener to conclude. Kyle, surfacing from 7 days of near death into the warmth of a woman's hand and the picture she was painting, concluded. Simran walked back in 10 minutes later, fresh-faced and dry-eyed and slightly less trembling, to find the king sitting up with Helen at his side and an expression on his face that she couldn't, for a moment, interpret. Then she could. It was the expression of a man who has decided something, who has placed someone in a category and closed the door. "You're awake," she said, and felt something crack very quietly in the center of her chest. "I am," he said, politely. "Thank you for your care, as if it were a transaction, as if 7 days had been a service rendered, as if he hadn't felt her hands on his chest in the dark and known, somewhere below consciousness, exactly whose warmth it was." Helen smiled at her across the bed. Simran understood, with the particular clarity of someone very good at seeing what is actually in front of them, exactly what had happened. She said, "Of course," and left the room. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her still slightly trembling hands and let herself, privately and briefly, feel the full depth of what this was. Then she put it away. She had practice. She had won. Helen knew how to identify winning. She had been doing it in small ways her entire life. The right word at the right moment, the right expression, the right strategic absence of information. And she knew the particular internal quality of having successfully navigated a complex situation to the outcome she needed. She had won. Kyle believed her. She could see it in the reorganization of his attention, the way his eyes had shifted, the way he spoke about Simran with a new distance, the way he spoke to Helen with a new proximity. She had taken nothing from him and given nothing to him and simply placed a story between them, and he had walked into it the way men who believe they are too powerful to be manipulated always walk into manipulations. She should feel triumphant. She sat in the chair by the window of her guest room and looked at the morning palace grounds and waited for the triumph to arrive. It was taking a long time. She thought about the moment Simran had walked back in. The expression on Simran's face. Not anger. Not betrayal. Not the explosive grief of someone discovering a knife in their back. Just understanding. The quiet, immediate understanding of a woman who has seen this shape before and recognized it instantly and knew exactly what it meant and was not surprised. She wasn't surprised, Helen thought. She expected this from me. For a reason she couldn't entirely account for, this bothered her more than anything else. She thought about what she had built here in these weeks at the Northern Reach. She had built proximity to a king. She had built a story. She had built a position, temporary but a position, and she had done it the only way she knew how, which was by identifying what the room required and providing it. She had not built anything real. The thought arrived and she pushed it aside. Real, she thought. Simran's real. Look at what real gets you. An estate that was never truly hers. Parents who chose the easier story over the true one. 7 days by a man's bedside that he would now attribute to someone else. Real was the cliff edge. Real was the second best room. She was right. She was also, somewhere beneath the correctness, not entirely comfortable. She got up. She went to find Kyle, who was awake now and needed her to be there when he looked for her, because the architecture of the thing she had built required maintenance. She passed Simran in the corridor. Simran did not stop, did not speak, did not make eye contact. Simply walked past with the particular quality of someone who has decided that you are not worth their energy. Not as an insult, but as a fact, a quiet divestment, the removal of the investment of attention. Helen stopped. She turned. Simran had already turned the corner. Helen stood in the corridor for a moment with nobody watching and felt something move through her that was neither triumph nor guilt but the complicated territory where those things bleed into each other, and which she had no vocabulary for, and which she walked away from as quickly as she could. She filed it somewhere. Later. She would think about it later. She did not think about it later. But the file stayed where she put it, and sometimes, in the dark of the second-best rooms she would occupy for the rest of her life, she opened it and looked. It was, in its structure, remarkably familiar. A man predisposed to believe the convenient thing. A woman skilled at providing it. The slow accumulation of small moments. A cold look here, a pointed absence there. until the person being written out of the story could no longer recognize themselves in what was being told about them. Kyle did not become monstrous. He became distant in the particular way of someone who has reorganized his understanding of a person and now processes them according to the new file. Simran. Not what I thought. Somewhat careless. Perhaps using this situation for social gain. He was not cruel to her. He was simply no longer warm, and the loss of that specific warmth, after she had begun to lean into it without realizing she was doing so, was its own flavor of cold. He put Helen in the rooms adjacent to his. He began consulting Helen on the border disputes instead of her. He gave Helen the books from the library that Simran had been reading. None of these were dramatic gestures. They were the reconfiguration of a social architecture, and they were effective. Simran watched. She noted. She did not yet understand the full dimensions of what Helen had said. But she understood enough. And she understood, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who has been here before, that arguing, presenting her case, demanding to be believed, would accomplish nothing. The people who have already decided have already decided. She went to the infirmary on Wednesdays. She read in the library when the books that were available were the books Helen hadn't taken. She walked the grounds in the mornings. She survived. The formal announcements came from the Alpha Council on a Thursday morning, delivered by sealed letter to every major household in the Northern Territories. It is with great pleasure that the Council announces. His Majesty Alpha King Kyle will be wed to Lady Simran of Ashenvale, daughter of Lord Thorn, on the first moon of the autumn season. His Majesty King Asta of the Dark Western Realm will be wed to Lady Helen, daughter of Lord Thorn, on the same occasion. The letters had a logic to them that the council found elegant. Both daughters of Ashenvale, both settled in matches that strengthened different diplomatic territories, a neat symmetry. Helen read her letter and went absolutely white. King Asta of the Dark Western Realm. King Asta. She knew the name. Everyone knows the name the way you know the name of a storm system or a tidal pattern, something you track from a distance and prefer to keep there. The Dark Western Realm sat at the edge of the werewolf territories like a place the world had run out of enthusiasm for. Volcanic rocky, perpetually stormlit, governed by a king who was spoken of in the same breath as words like formidable and unapproachable, and here was the thing that was making Helen's hands shake. Blind. King Asta had lost his sight in battle 4 years ago. Some said a curse. Some said a blade. Either way, he had been blind for 4 years, ruling his strange dark kingdom alone, allowing no one close, a figure of power and fury and absolute, legendary solitude. She was to marry him. Helen went to her father that evening with the calculated desperation of someone who has always known that emotional displays, deployed precisely, are a resource. I won't do it, she said. She let her eyes fill with tears. She was good at this. Father, I would rather die than marry a blind king in that place. Please, please don't make me do this. Lord Thorn looked uncomfortable. He had been looking uncomfortable frequently since the Alpha King's household had undergone its subtle shift. Something was happening, some current he hadn't fully charted, and he was a man who did not like currents he couldn't chart. These matches are council-made, he said. I have no authority to. There must be something. She took his hands. Father, please. Across the manor, in the small room that had been her mother's and that she still thought of as such, though she had been given different quarters, Simran had her own letter. She read it twice. She thought about the morning Kyle had woken up, the expression on his face, the way he had said thank you for your care as if settling an invoice. She thought about Helen's face across the bed. She thought about the particular mathematics of the situation, 2 daughters, 2 kings, and a configuration that everyone around her was calling obvious but that she could see, if she looked at it from the angle of a woman who had spent her entire life paying attention, was not even slightly that. She thought about her mother, who had healed because it was what she was made for, who had been faithful because faithfulness was her nature, who had died in a house that stopped deserving her years before the end. She thought, I am not going to repeat this pattern. Then she went to find her father. Lord Thorne's expression when Simran walked into the room was complicated. Guilt was in there, and surprise at her composure, and the particular unease of a man confronted with the person he has wronged in their full, undiminished dignity. "Simran," he said, "you've received the letter." "I have," she said. "I've also spoken with Helen." She had not. She had listened to Helen through a door, not deliberately, but the manor's old stonework carried voices in ways people forgot, and she had heard the shape of her stepsister's desperation clearly enough. "The match with King Kyle is—" "I want to propose a change," Simran said. "I will go to King Asta, in Helen's place." Silence. Lord Thorne stared at her. Even Marian, who had been in the corner with her needlework and her careful non-presence, looked up. "That's not," Thorne began. "I am not finished," Simran said, with a pleasantness in her voice that had a spine of iron through it. "I will go to King Asta. Helen will go to King Kyle, with whom she seems considerably more comfortable. The switch will remain secret until the wedding day. The brides will be veiled, the carriages dispatched, and no one will know until it's done." She paused. "In exchange for this arrangement, which solves your current problem very neatly, you will give me back everything of my mother's that has been redistributed since her death. Her books, her jewels, her journals, her healer's collection. Everything. It comes to me." Lord Thorne opened his mouth. "And one more thing," Simran added. "You will write a letter, formal, witnessed, acknowledging that everything in my mother Tori's estate belongs to me by right of blood and inheritance, and that you have no further claim on it. This letter goes to the Alpha Council for their records." Helen was standing in the doorway now. She had heard enough to understand the shape of it. Her expression moved from relief to something more complex. Not quite gratitude, not quite guilt, but the territory adjacent to both. "Why?" Marian asked. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was genuinely puzzled. "You'd give up the Alpha King for a blind man in the dark reaches?" Simran looked at Marian with the composed, clear gaze of someone who has decided they no longer need to be understood by certain people. "Yes," she said simply, because she had understood what Marian, despite all her cleverness, had not. A man who can be turned against you with 20 minutes and a handhold and a strategically incomplete truth is not a safe man to love. Whatever Simran had begun to feel for Kyle, and she would not examine it closely, not now, not in this room. It was a feeling she had learned, in 7 days of holding his life steady with her bare hands, to know clearly. And she knew, with that same clarity, that the version of herself who stayed and fought for his belief and eventually proved herself through what? More sacrifice? More extraordinary competence performed in hopes of finally being seen? Was a version of herself she recognized too well. It was her mother, and her mother had died in that version. "Agreed," Lord Thorne said quietly. Marian said nothing. Helen, in the doorway, looked at Simran with something that was not quite an apology but was not nothing either. Simran went back to the northern reach and resumed her ordinary days, and did not tell Kyle and did not tell anyone and was very calm and was, if she was honest with herself in the late blue hours before sleep, also very sad. She was allowed to be sad. She had earned it. The morning of the double wedding arrived under a sky of chalky white clouds that couldn't decide whether it wanted to storm or clear. The Ashenvale Manor had been dressed for the occasion. Garlands of mountain flowers, servants in formal livery, the courtyard cleared and set with tables for the reception that would follow the departure of both brides. In the bridal chambers, 2 women in wedding white. Helen was magnificent. She had made herself magnificent the way she did everything, with focused, technical excellence and no sentimentality whatsoever. The gown Kyle's household had sent was pure white silk with silver embroidery at the cuffs and hem, and it fit her perfectly because it had been sized and shaped for Simran, and Marian had quietly had it adjusted without comment. Simran was in the dark gown. King Asta's household had sent dark violet silk, almost black, trimmed with something that caught light strangely. Not gemstones, but something older, volcanic glass perhaps, Tiny chips of it worked into the fabric so that the whole dress shimmered like a night sky. It was not what most brides would choose. It was extraordinary. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. "You could still change your mind," Helen said from behind her. "Could I?" Simran asked pleasantly. Helen was quiet. "No," Simran said, answering her own question. "Neither could you." They veiled themselves. The veils were the kind that covered everything. Face, throat, the particular set of the chin that might otherwise distinguish one woman from another. They had been chosen specifically. This had all been chosen specifically. They went downstairs. In the courtyard, 2 carriages. Kyle had sent his own formal wedding carriage, the white one with the northern reach crest and 4 pale horses. King Asta's carriage was, appropriately, entirely black, with horses so dark they absorbed the thin morning light. The guests saw 2 veiled women and made the assignments their expectations told them to make. The Alpha King's bride in the Alpha King's white carriage. The Dark Realm bride in the Dark Realm carriage. Simran walked to the black carriage and stepped inside. The door closed. The carriage began to move. She breathed. She thought, forward. Always forward. It is the only direction that matters. The black carriage moved at the pace of inevitability. Simran had expected fear. She had prepared for it in the way she prepared for all difficult things, by sitting with it beforehand, turning it over, finding its edges and understanding them, so that when it arrived it would find her already acquainted. She had prepared for the hollow drop of leaving everything she knew, the grief of the road moving beneath her, the particular vertigo of a woman traveling toward a life she had chosen but could not yet see. She had not prepared for the quiet. The dark Western Realms carriage was insulated differently from any vehicle she had traveled in before. The interior lined with something dense and dark that swallowed sound, so that the world outside became a muffled impression rather than a reality. The horses' hooves on the stone road arrived as felt vibration rather than sound. The wind was a pressure against the walls, not a voice. She sat in the quiet and breathed. She thought about the morning she had gone to her father. She had rehearsed the conversation 3 times, had walked through it in her room, pacing the narrow corridor of space between bed and window, testing arguments the way a carpenter tests joints. What she had not rehearsed was the moment she walked into the sitting room and found not just her father but Helen there too, curled in the good chair with her knees drawn up and her face still blotched from crying and looking, for the first time in Simran's experience of her, genuinely small. Helen had looked up. Simran had looked back. And something had passed between them. Not warmth, not forgiveness, not the sudden erasure of everything that had been done, but something. Recognition, perhaps. The specific recognition of 2 women who have both been shaped painfully by the same bad situation, and who understand without saying so that the shaping is not the same as the fault. Helen had not spoken, but she had not looked away. And when Simran had laid out her terms, her mother's belongings, the witnessed letter, the secret kept until the veil dropped, Helen had been entirely still, and there had been something in that stillness that was not the bright calculation Simran was accustomed to reading in her. It was something more complicated. Something that Simran, who read people as carefully as she read herbs, by smell and texture and what they revealed under pressure, could not immediately name. She named it now, in the quiet carriage, on the road to her new life. Shame. Helen, who had learned from infancy that the world was divided into those who take and those who are taken from, and who had chosen with absolute clarity which category to occupy, had felt shame. It was not enough. It did not undo anything. But it was something. A seed of a thing. A crack in the calcified architecture of who she had decided to be. Simran did not know what Helen would do with it. She supposed she would probably never find out. She put Helen away. She thought, instead, about what she was traveling toward. King Asta of the Dark Western Realm. She had done her research. Of course she had. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother had never once gone into a situation without understanding it as thoroughly as available information allowed. The palace library had a section on the Outer Kingdoms, and she had spent the 3 days between her agreement with her father and the wedding morning reading everything in it, which was not, she admitted, very much. What she had. He was 28 years old. He had ruled the dark western realm for 6 years, having inherited it at 22 upon his father's death in the Battle of Werewolf, which was, she had found this in a military history, not in the diplomatic records, a battle that 22-year-old Asta had won through a strategy so tactically unconventional that 3 separate military historians had written about it in incredulous tones that barely concealed their admiration. He had won a battle that should not have been winnable, and he had done it as a new and untested king, and the dark western realm had been stable and ungoverned from outside ever since, which was either a testament to his governance or his terrifying reputation, and probably both. He had lost his sight 4 years ago. The records were vague on this, deliberately vague, she suspected, the kind of vagueness that powerful households cultivate around the vulnerabilities of powerful men. A blade, possibly. Curse, possibly. The outcome was documented in the physical record of every diplomatic communication since. All correspondence was handled verbally, transcribed by his council secretary. All treaty documents were confirmed through proxy. He received no written petitions. He had never married. Had, as far as she could determine, never had a serious attachment of any kind, or if he had, it had been managed with discretion that her research could not penetrate. The dark western realm did not export personal information about its king. It exported reputation and reputation alone, and the reputation was formidable. Do not approach unless invited. Do not mistake silence for absence. She had read this and thought, good, I understand silence. I understand absence. I have lived in both. She had also thought, he will not be easy. She had also thought, nothing worthwhile has been. The carriage climbed. She felt it in the shift of angle, the change in air pressure, the way the temperature dropped in increments so gradual she only noticed looking back. At some point between midday and late afternoon, the air had gone from autumn cool to something sharper, thinner, with the particular mineral quality of altitude. She pressed her face closer to the cracked window. The landscape had changed completely. The broad river valleys and managed forests of the Northern Territories had given way to something older and less accommodating. Black rock in vast shelves and columns, the road cut directly through it rather than around it, and above and ahead, the Ashgar Mountains' volcanic cousins, darker, steeper, trailing thin streamers of sulphurous cloud from their highest vents. It was not beautiful in any way she had previously understood beauty. But she pressed her face to the glass and looked, and somewhere in the looking she felt something adjust in her chest. The particular shift that happens when the mind encounters something so entirely unlike its expectations that it stops comparing and begins simply to receive. It was extraordinary. Different, she thought. Not less. Different. She sat back. Outside, the road began its final climb toward the black gates of the dark western realm. She straightened her spine. She was Simran of Ashenvale, daughter of Tori the healer, daughter of a pure bloodline that stretched back to the first moon. She had been pushed off a cliff. She had held a king's life steady with her bare hands for 7 days. She had walked out of her father's house with nothing and built, from nothing, a version of herself that was. She could say this now, quietly, without arrogance, simply as a fact she had earned worth knowing. She was going to meet her husband. Whatever he was, she was equal to it. She believed this. The gates opened. She went in. They were perhaps a mile down the road when it happened. A gust of wind, sharp from the eastern ridge, the kind that comes off the mountain in late autumn with no warning and no apology, caught Simran's veil and lifted it. Through the carriage window, she glimpsed the white wedding carriage ahead, already turning onto the far road. Behind her, she heard hoofbeats, many of them. She looked out the back window and saw Kyle. He was riding at full gallop, and he had abandoned the formality of the occasion entirely. Jacket askew, horse pushed to absolute speed, his face showing an expression she had never seen on him before and couldn't name from this distance except that it was large. Whatever he was feeling, it was large. The carriages did not stop. She had told the driver, "Do not stop for any reason until we reach the territorial boundary." She had planned for this possibility. She had understood, in her careful, clear-eyed way, that Kyle would see and Kyle would react, because Kyle was not actually a bad man. He was a man who had made a bad mistake and whose body would recognize, even if his pride took longer, what that meant. He rode hard. He was very fast. The territorial boundary was faster. She watched his horse slow at the boundary line, the invisible edge where his authority ended and another king's began, and where, even in extremis, the Alpha King could not follow without cause for war, and she watched him stop. She watched him watch the black carriage disappear around the mountain road. She turned back to face forward. She was going to the dark western realm. She was going to meet the man she had married in proxy and name. She was terrified. She was also, underneath the terror, buried, but there, something that was not quite ready to be named yet. Free, it whispered. She pressed it flat. But it was there. The dark western realm was not dark in the poetic sense people seem to imagine. It was not gloomy or gothic or draped in perpetual shadow for atmospheric purposes. It was dark in the geological sense. Black stone everywhere, the particular basalt that volcanic country throws up in columns and plateaus, shot through with veins of copper and iron or that oxidized to red, so the whole landscape red as black and rust and the occasional violent green of plants determined to grow through rock. The palace, if you could call it that, was built into the mountain itself. Carved, not constructed. You didn't assemble this place from raw materials. You removed the mountain from around it, hollowing out great chambers whose walls still had the rippled texture of whatever process had shaped them before human hands intervened. Simran decided as her carriage passed through the gate, genuinely the most arresting place she had ever seen, and she wished she had more than a cracked carriage window to see it through. She had perhaps 4 minutes to form this impression before the carriage stopped and the door opened and a man was standing there who was clearly a palace official of some rank. And beyond him were steps leading up into the mountain, and at the top of the steps stood King Asta. She had prepared herself for this. She had not, she now understood, prepared herself adequately. He was taller than Kyle by 2 inches and built differently, not broader but more dense, as if he'd been made from heavier material. His hair was the particular reddish-black of the volcanic rocks around them, and his face was— she took a careful inventory because she was going to be looking at it for the foreseeable future. Angular in the way of faces that have been tested and have met the test, with a mouth that was not unkind but was clearly unfamiliar with being kind. His eyes were open and they were very beautiful and they saw nothing. He stood at the top of the steps with his hands behind his back and his chin lifted very slightly, the particular stance of someone who has learned to project authority in the absence of the visual information most leaders unconsciously rely on, and waited. His household official leaned towards Simran and said very quietly, "His Majesty does not. He isn't. The transition period has been—" The man stopped, regrouped. "Please understand that he may seem—" "I understand," she said gently. "Shall we go up?" She went up. She stopped before him at the top of the steps. "Your Majesty," she said. "I am. I know who you are," he said. His voice was low and flat with disuse. "You're the daughter of Lord Thorn, sent here in your sister's place under the assumption that I'm too blind to have noticed the switch." Silence. "I have ears," he said. "Your household sent a message through official channels describing a dark-haired woman of a specific height and particular scent. The woman who arrived has the right height. Your scent is correct for a pure-blood heir with a healer's heritage." Pause. "Your sister would have smelled like a human woman wrapped in wolf territory perfume. She would not have smelled like wildflowers and thornwood lavender and something older. Some bloodline quality that she doesn't carry." He had known. He had known before the carriage had even stopped. "Why didn't you?" she began. "Why didn't I turn the carriage away?" Something moved in his face. "Because the one they were going to send me would have been miserable here. Miserable people in confined spaces make miserable households. And because," he stopped, "because someone who volunteers for the difficult assignment instead of being forced into it is, statistically, more likely to have reasons." He turned and walked back into the mountain palace with the absolute surety of a man who has memorized every inch of his terrain. Follow me or don't, he said. But if you're staying, you should see your rooms before dark. She followed him. Of course she followed him. He drove her away the next morning. It was not subtle. She had been in the grand library. Enormous, vaulted, stocked with books that had been read and annotated by hands she didn't recognize and organized in a system she couldn't immediately decipher. When she heard him coming, she knew his footsteps. He moved with controlled deliberateness, the same careful authority as at the cliff, and she'd been cataloging the sound of him since she arrived. "You're in my library," he said. "I am," she agreed. "I use it in the mornings. I can go. I don't want to disrupt your—" He stopped. "Yes, go." She went. He found her in the eastern garden, a sheltered microclimate where some patient predecessor had grown herbs in the volcanic warmth. 2 hours later. "You're outside," he said. "I am. I walk the eastern path in the late morning. I'll find a different path. The western path has uneven ground. I'll be careful." She moved. She watched him navigate, not haltingly, not with the shuffling overcaution of someone afraid of space, but with the memorized confidence of his own terrain. He put his hands on things lightly as he passed them. A stone column, the edge of a bench, a wall. Not for guidance but for the proprioceptive confirmation that the world was where he'd placed it in his mental map. She thought, he has built the whole palace in his mind. She thought, he has had to build himself a new world from sound and texture and memory. She thought, that must have been very lonely. "Stop," he said. She stopped. He turned in her direction. He did not look at her. His gaze was slightly off, as it always was, aimed at a point adjacent to where she stood, but she had the feeling of being assessed by something more precise than eyes. "You're watching me," he said. "I'm paying attention to you," she said. "That's different." "How?" "Watching suggests I'm looking for weakness. Paying attention suggests I'm trying to understand." He was quiet. "I don't need understanding," he said. "No," she agreed. "You seem to need very little from anyone. That must be exhausting." He blinked. The involuntary kind, a physical reaction to something unexpected. "I beg your pardon. Being entirely self-sufficient," she said. "It's an achievement. It's also, I imagine, very heavy. You've been carrying it for 4 years. She looked at him, the tense set of his shoulders, the controlled economy of every movement. "I'm a healer. I noticed these things." Something happened to his face. Not softening exactly, more like the wall didn't lower but the thing behind it leaned very slightly forward. "I told you," he said slowly. "I don't allow people close." "I know," she said. She did not say, "I will not respect that." She did not need to. She went back inside and let the eastern path be his. She came back to the garden the next day. He was there. He did not tell her to leave. It began with his headaches. She noticed them first at dinner, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way he would turn his head to adjust the sound's assault, the visible effort of maintaining his composure through a meal when his skull was clearly attempting to remove itself from his body. "The headaches," she said one evening. He stilled. "They're a consequence of the injury," she said. "Whatever took your sight also damaged the optical pathways. The nerves are still there, they're just disconnected, and sometimes they fire anyway, randomly, and the brain processes that as pain because it doesn't know what else to do with input that doesn't match any signal it can read." She paused. "There's a technique. Pressure points, mostly, with some directed heat work. My mother used it for nerve pain. I don't want. I know you don't want me near you. I'm asking you to consider whether what you want is more important than what would help you." Silence. "You are," he said, "extraordinarily difficult." "I'm informed," she said. "That's a different thing." He let her try it, with the rigid stillness of a man enduring something he has consented to under protest. She worked the pressure points at his temples and the base of his skull with careful, small thumbs, and after 20 minutes she felt him, fractionally, invisibly relax. He said nothing. The next time his headache arrived, he found her in the library. He sat down across from her. "You could have sent for me," she said. "I'm here," he said. She put down her book and came around the table, and he let her. The days arranged themselves differently after that. He came to trust her proximity the way a person comes to trust a specific sound, gradually and then completely, and then in a way that made the absence of it strange. She moved around him, and he tracked her in the particular way of the non-visual. Sound, scent, the slight change in air currents when she entered a room. He began, unconsciously, to orient toward her. She talked to him, not performatively, not the bright patter of someone keeping up the atmosphere, but the way she had written in the margins of books, exchanging thoughts with someone she took seriously. She described what she saw. The way the light moved through the basalt, the copper veins lit to orange in the afternoon, the hawks that circled the western peaks, the way the volcanic soil made the herbs grow differently, faster, smaller-leafed, more concentrated in flavor. "You're describing it," he said once. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She considered this. "Because you built the palace from memory and sound, and I imagine the inside version and the outside version occasionally need updating." He was very quiet. "The hawks," he said. "Do they come from the north ridge or the south?" "North," she said. "They follow the thermal off the black stone shelf about halfway up." "Yes," he said, like she'd confirmed something. "I can hear them there. I thought it was north." She looked at him, at this man who had built an entire world out of sound and memory and iron will, and who was, under all of it, simply someone trying to know where the hawks came from. Something shifted in her chest. She noted it. She did not examine it immediately, but she noted it. The month passed, and Simran spent it learning King Asta the way she had spent her life learning things. Carefully, thoroughly, with attention. He was not easy. He was formal in ways that had calcified over 4 years of solo rule, and private in ways that went deeper than formality, and he had not, in 4 years, touched another person except in combat or in the clinical context of physicians who came and went and none of whom had stayed. He had forgotten how to need people. She remembered it for him. She did not do this deliberately. She simply continued being what she was: present, warm, interested without being intrusive, capable without being threatening. And the particular ecosystem she created around herself was, apparently, one he could breathe in. On the last day of the month, she felt the headache coming before he did. She met him in the corridor with her hands already warming. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. He sat. Her hands found his temples. "Simran," he said. "Yes." He stopped. She waited. "I have been," he said with enormous, visible difficulty. "Not entirely unwelcoming," she thought. "He has just told me that he is glad I am here." She recognized this as the maximum extent of what was currently available and received it exactly as it was given. "I know," she said. He breathed. She thought. "Oh," she thought. "This is the thing I was not going to examine immediately. I am in love with my husband." She did not say it. She was a careful woman, and he had built his walls from 4 years of solitary difficulty. And she understood that love was not something you announced to someone like Asta. It was something you demonstrated slowly and consistently until the person stopped being surprised by it. She had time. She thought she had time. In the northern reach, certain discoveries were being made. It began, as many things begin, with a conversation someone should not have had where they did. Marian had come to the northern reach as a guest. The new Alpha Queen Helen's mother, technically, which was a position she was already enjoying with the particular relish of someone who has waited a long time for their moment. She was at dinner with Helen and Helen's closest attendant, and the wine had made her careless. "I'll admit," she said, "I didn't think it would work as easily as it did." Helen shushed her. "He's not here, darling," Marian said. "And even if he were, he's already married to you. What's he going to do? Men are so." "Mother." He practically caught himself. Marian laughed, low and satisfied. What kind of man hears a woman say she's been by his side and believes it wholesale without without thinking. Honestly, some alpha king. Helen's attendant's eyes went wide and slid to something over Marion's shoulder. Marion turned. Kyle was in the doorway. He had come back early from a council meeting and taken the short corridor to the dining room because it was faster. He had been in that corridor for approximately 90 seconds. Long enough for the words I didn't think would work as easily as it did, and practically caught himself and the entirety of Marion's laughter to reach him. The silence in the dining room had a specific quality. Kyle's face had a specific quality. "My lord," Helen began. "Which part," he said very quietly, "was true?" What followed had the inexorable quality of an avalanche, the kind that began somewhere high and clean and built mass as it descended. The physicians were questioned separately and specifically. Petra was questioned. The duty records were reviewed. Marin, who had known from day one what had happened and had been waiting, with the patience of someone confident in the long arc, for this particular reckoning, provided testimony that was precise, complete, and devastating. "She was there for 7 days, Marin said, in her cedar and efficiency voice. "Every night, every morning." Lady Helen came and went when the room was quiet and Lady Simran had stepped away. Kyle listened. He did not show what was happening inside him, because he had been trained from birth to be a king, and kings do not perform their interior damage. But the court saw something new enter his face that had not been there before. Something that was neither anger nor grief, but the place those two things share when they combine under pressure. He punished Lord Thorne and Marion and Helen with the measured thoroughness of a man applying justice. He banished them from the kingdom. Then he went to prepare for war. The road out of the northern reach was long and straight and offered no mercy in the form of scenery. Helen sat in the back of the supply cart. Not a carriage, a cart, the palace steward having interpreted banished with a literalism that she suspected was intentional, and watched the northern reach's gates grow smaller and did not cry. She was very good at not crying. She had practiced. Her mother sat beside her, wrapped in the fur that was her one concession to self-pity, and was saying something about unfairness and overreaction and the fickleness of powerful men, and Helen listened without hearing, which was a skill she had also practiced. Lord Thorne sat across from them, looking at his hands. He had aged in the last few hours, not physically, but in the way that a person ages when the story they have been telling themselves about who they are is revised without warning. He had been telling himself for 15 years that he was a man in a complicated situation doing his best. The best had included 2 women, a choice made in a faraway country and then smuggled home, the systematic dismantling of his firstborn daughter's life in his own house. He had told himself it was complicated. He had told himself that Simran was adaptable. He had told himself many things. The Alpha King's face, in those 4 minutes of measured administrative certainty, had revised all of them. Helen looked at her father. She thought, "You are the reason I am like this." She thought, "You showed me that love is a resource, that it can be reallocated, that it moves toward whoever needs it least and is given to whoever demands it most. You showed me this before I was 13 years old." She thought, "I learned from watching you." She was not absolved by this. She knew that. She was clever enough to know that the origin of a pattern does not excuse its perpetuation. But it was information, context, the kind of thing that didn't change what she'd done but changed how she understood herself in the doing of it. She thought about Simran. She thought about the deal Simran had offered, so clean, so fair, so entirely without the vindictiveness that Helen, in Simran's position, could not have resisted. Simran had solved the problem that most benefited her stepsister and had asked, in return, only what was already rightfully hers. She had not asked for apology. She had not asked for acknowledgement. She had simply identified the terms that would make the situation workable and presented them. And then she had gone to marry a blind king in a dark country, and she had done it without complaint and without performance. And the last thing Helen had seen of her was a dark violet veil and a straight spine and the back of a head that turned neither right nor left. "I wonder," Helen thought, "if she's all right." The thought surprised her. She sat with it because there was nothing else to do in the back of a cart on a long straight road, and it was too uncomfortable to simply discard. I wonder if she's all right. She was not going to find out. She was banished. She had nowhere to go except her mother's remaining connections, which were not many, and the future they could construct from those connections, which was not certain. She had gambled and lost, and she was sitting in the back of a cart in the cold morning air with nothing to show for it. She thought, what would Simran do? She thought she would look at what is actually in front of her and begin there. She looked at what was actually in front of her. A road, a cart, her mother who was afraid, her father who was lost, a future that had no shape yet because it had not been built yet. She had, in point of fact, built things before. Just the wrong things, with the wrong materials, for the wrong reasons. She thought, perhaps I am not finished. She did not transform in the back of the cart. People do not transform in carts. She did not become Simran. She did not become good and clear and free of the calcification of her particular survival education. That was not a cart ride. But she stopped crying. Internally, the crying she had been doing underneath all the not crying, the private grief of a woman who has spent so much of herself on the wrong investment that she cannot even clearly see the value she squandered. She stopped crying. She looked at the road. She began. He came with 20 riders. The message he sent ahead was formal and terse. A request for an audience with King Asta. The message that traveled underneath the formal one, in the body language of his riders and the particular crested armor they wore, was something less negotiable. Simran was in the eastern garden when they arrived. She heard the horses. She stood, walked to the western wall where she could see the courtyard without being immediately visible. Watched 20 riders bearing the northern reach crest come through the black gates and felt something complicated happen in her chest. Not fear, not quite, but the particular full-body awareness of standing at a crossroads. She went inside to find her husband. Asta met Kyle in the receiving hall, and the two men occupied their positions in the room like opposing weather systems, each catastrophically capable of damage and each aware of it. Simran could see through the half-open door, preparing himself carefully for something he thought was going to be difficult. He had come with arguments. He had come with the political framework, the wrongful match, the concealed switch, the case for her return. He had come, she thought, with the particular energy of a man performing a belated rescue. He had not, she thought, come with much understanding of what he was rescuing her to. She is my wife, Asta said. He said it flatly, with no particular emphasis, the way you would state a coordinate. The match was obtained through deception, Kyle said. Her family deceptively substituted. Voluntarily, Simran said. From the doorway, both men turned. She walked into the room. She was wearing dark violet because it was what she had and because she had stopped, some weeks ago, thinking of it as the Dark Realm's colors and started thinking of it as hers. I substituted myself voluntarily, she said to Kyle. I chose this. Kyle looked at her. Something in his face was raw in a way she had never seen. Simran, he said, I know what I did. I know I was wrong about everything. I know that now. I know you know, she said. Marin sent word. Then you know that you punished them. Yes. She paused. Thank you. Truly. I know that mattered, and I know you did it for the right reasons. He looked at her, and the raw thing in his face became more raw. I thought you might come back. If you knew that Kyle, she said, not unkindly. I am in love with my husband. Silence. You've been here 1 month, he said. Yes, she said. He absorbed this. He barely. Kyle stopped. I looked at Asta. He is the man I married, she said. And I would ask you to respect that and go home. Kyle looked at her for a long, unshielded moment. Looked at the woman he had underestimated while she was tending his life in the dark. Had misjudged when his judgment was lazy and untested. Had tried to hold when he finally understood what he was losing and found that the horizon does not wait for you to be ready. He said, "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. She meant it. But she did not go with him. He did not leave. She should have known he would not simply leave. The man was an alpha king, which meant that he had been trained from birth to persist, and he had now combined that training with genuine remorse and genuine attachment, and the result was a man who could not make himself turn his horses south. He stayed in the border territories, 2 days' ride from the dark western realm. He brooded. He planned. He made the decision that men who love without knowing how to lose make eventually, when the thing they love doesn't return to them. He reached for the thing that had always worked before. Force. He had a poison blade prepared. He rode back to the dark realm. The challenge came formally, a combat request, as was his right under ancient law between kingdom lords. Asta accepted, as was his right and inevitability. Simran stood at the edge of the field and watched her husband prepare with the composed focus of a man who has no illusions about the difficulty of what he's doing. He was, she knew, extraordinary in combat. His other senses had compensated beyond what physiology should allow, and he had spent 4 years training himself in techniques that did not require sight. He was also, she knew, slightly disadvantaged by the fact that Kyle was fighting with desperate energy, and desperation added unpredictable quantities to any equation. She also knew because Asta had told her 3 nights ago with the careful honesty of a man who has decided that the person beside him deserves the truth, that his reaction time in the first moments of any combat was slightly slower on his left side. A nerve damage artifact that he had worked to compensate for but had never fully corrected. She wanted to tell him to stand down. She wanted to tell Kyle to go home. She wanted to stand in the middle of the field and simply refuse to allow either of them to do this, because she was pregnant. She knew she was pregnant. She had the particular internal certainty of a healer who had spent enough time understanding her own body to know immediately when something changed. And she had not yet told Asta because the time had not been right, and now there were 2 men in a field preparing to do something catastrophically stupid, and the time was even less right. She watched. She breathed. She was afraid. The fight was brutal and fast and exactly as dangerous as she had anticipated. Kyle was fighting with something beyond strategy, a kind of all-in desperation that bypassed technical skill, and Asta's extraordinary precision was, for the first 10 minutes, more than equal to it. Then Kyle went left. The blade caught Asta on his left side. Not deep, but it caught him, and Simran saw the moment it happened not just in Asta's flinch but in Kyle's face. The quick, calculating expression of a man who has done the thing he planned to do. "Stop," she said, and was already moving. Kyle held up the blade. "The edge is poisoned," he said. He was breathing hard. He looked, not triumphant but desperate, the face of a man doing something terrible for reasons that are, inside his chest, genuinely urgent. "I have the antidote." He held up the other hand, a small vial. Come with me, and I give him the antidote." The field was very quiet. "Kyle," she said. "Simran." His voice broke, just slightly, at the edges. "Please, I can't just let you." She looked at her husband. Asta was very still. The wound on his side was already beginning to heat. She could see it from where she stood, the faint shimmer of the poison working. His face showed nothing. He was the most controlled person she had ever met. But he turned his face slightly toward her. Not looking, he could not look, but orienting the way he had learned to orient to her voice, to her presence, to the particular quality of the air around her. He was afraid. He was afraid for her. She could see it in the angle of his head, the set of his shoulders. He was afraid she would go. "All right," she said. She had not planned to cry for him. She did not plan to cry for people. Tears were a resource like any other, and she spent them carefully, on things that had earned them. She had cried for her mother, fully and privately, and she had cried once in the early weeks at the Northern Reach when the reality of her situation had pressed down so completely that no amount of internal architecture could hold it at bay. Beyond those 2 occasions, she had been careful. She had not planned to cry for Kyle. She found that she had not, in fact, planned correctly. It had begun on the 5th day of her captivity, which was not captivity technically. The room was good. The food was regular. No one stood at her door. Kyle had made it clear, with the elaborate courtesy of a man trying to demonstrate that he was not doing what he was doing, that she was a guest, that she was free to go whenever she chose, that there was no compulsion. The antidote was the compulsion. She had asked for it on the first day, directly and without preamble. He had looked at the floor. He had said, "Come home and I'll administer it myself, you have my word." She had said, "Give it to me and I'll administer it myself." They had been at this impasse for 5 days, and the impasse was killing Asta, and she sat with that knowledge every hour and let it make her afraid and then let the fear sharpen into focus, because fear diffused was paralysis and fear focused was a tool. On the 5th day, Kyle came to her room after dinner, which he sometimes did. She did not invite him, but she did not turn him away, because the goal was the antidote and refusing him access made the goal less likely. He sat in the chair by the window and she sat on the edge of the bed and they looked at each other, and she thought, "He is thinner than when I first came here. He is not sleeping." "Tell me about him," Kyle said. She looked at him. "Asta," he said, "tell me about him. What he's like." She considered this request for a long moment. It could be a manipulation, gathering information, understanding what he was competing against. But she looked at Kyle's face, and it was not the face of a man gathering intelligence. It was the face of a man who is in pain and has run out of ways to avoid asking directly what causes it. "He's very still," she said, "in the way of people who have been forced to develop a complete internal world. He doesn't waste movement. He's memorized everything, every room, every path, and he moves through his own territory with more confidence than most sighted men move through theirs." She paused. "He's honest to the point of discomfort. He doesn't soften things. He says what is true and he expects you to be equal to the truth." "Do you like that?" Kyle asked. She thought about it. "I didn't at first. I was accustomed to people who communicated in layers. What they said and what they meant and what they actually needed being 3 different things." She looked at her hands. "He only has 1 layer. It's startling until it isn't." "Until it's what?" "Safe," she said. Kyle was quiet. "I was never like that with you," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I wasn't looking for that then. I thought—" She stopped. "What did you think?" She looked at him with the honesty she owed him, for he had at least earned that. "I thought that you were going to be someone I could trust, and then I thought I had been wrong. And the truth was somewhere between those things, which is usually where the truth is." He looked out the window. "I read all of your notes," he said. "In the margins. After you left." "I know. Marin told me. The one about the hawk behavioral patterns, you'd figured out their breeding territory from observation alone without—" He stopped. "I went to the library after you left. I found every book you'd written in. I sat there for—" He made a short, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. "I sat there for a long time." She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said, and this was the 4th time he had said it, and unlike the first 3 times, it arrived without the architecture underneath it. "Now I'm sorry, therefore come back. I'm sorry." "I know," she said. "It doesn't fix anything." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't fix anything." He nodded, like she had confirmed something he had already accepted. That night, she lay in the good room in the Northern Reach Palace and looked at the ceiling and thought, "He is not a bad man." This was not the exculpatory thought it might once have been. Bad men were simple, and simple things were easier to leave behind. He was a man who had been given enormous power very young and not enough models for what to do with it, who had learned that the story someone tells about you is more adhesive than the truth, who had genuinely, in his way, tried to be better and had not been better fast enough. She felt for him the specific grief of recognizing a person's potential after the window for it has closed. She did not go back to him, but she felt for him. On the 7th day, she asked to see Asta. Kyle took her himself. He walked beside her through the corridors with the bearing of a man accompanying someone to a verdict he has already accepted and is simply required to be present for. He did not touch her. He did not speak. The room where Asta was held was not cruel. Kyle was not, she had always known, deliberately cruel. But it was small and bare, and Asta was sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his head slightly bowed, and she saw immediately. He had been listening for her. The angle of his head, that orientation, that homing, was pointed at the door. He had been listening for her footsteps. She crossed the room in 4 steps and sat beside him and took his hands and felt. The pulse elevated, the temperature frightening, the wound sight, the poison deep and working. Her hands began doing what they did, assessing and beginning, moving into the automatic competence of her bloodline. Simran. Her name in his mouth, hoarse and flat and completely stripped of anything except the fact of her. "I'm here," she said. "You're here," he repeated. Not a question, not surprise, like he was placing a coordinate, like he was updating his mental map. "I'm here," she said again. His hands tightened on hers. She looked at Kyle over Asta's head. "Please," she said. Kyle looked at the two of them, at her hands on his, at the way Asta had oriented entirely toward her the moment she came in, at the full picture of what had been built in the dark western realm in a single month and what could not be unmade by force or captivity or antidote as leverage, and she watched him see it. Really see it. Not the story he had been carrying, but the actual thing in front of him. He closed his eyes. He reached into his coat. He held out the vial. She reached for it. "Wait." The word came quietly. He opened his eyes. He was looking at the vial in her hand, and his expression had passed through something she could not name and arrived somewhere she recognized. Decision. "There's something you should know," he said. She looked at him. He showed her the blade. The blade he had been carrying for 7 days. The blade he had used on Asta. The blade he had, in some moment she had not witnessed and could not account for, used on himself. "The same poison," he said. He stopped. I looked at his hand. The faintest tremor, barely visible. "I administered it 3 hours ago. There's only enough antidote for one." The room was very still. "Kyle," she said. "I need you to choose," he said. His voice was entirely steady. He had made this decision 3 hours ago, and he had had 3 hours to make peace with it, and whatever he had done in those 3 hours was done, and this moment was simply the execution of the choice. "Take it. Save him." "You knew I would," she said. "Yes." Something in his face. "I knew you would. That's the point." She looked at him, this man, this king, who had seen her on a cliff edge and stepped between her and the drop, who had lost her through his own carelessness and never quite recovered from the losing, who had made terrible choices in service of a real feeling and had finally, here, at the bottom of everything, found the way to be the person he had always theoretically intended to be. "Kyle, don't," he said gently. "Don't try to fix this. You can't fix this. I can try." "Simran." He looked at her. "I have been trying to be saved for a very long time." A pause. "I think this is the version of being saved that I actually needed." She looked at him for a long, full moment. She took the antidote. She turned to Asta. She administered it. She kept her back to Kyle for as long as it took to feel Asta's pulse begin its slow turn back toward something sustainable. And in that time she did not cry, because there was still work to do and she needed her hands and her focus, and she could not afford to lose either. When she turned back, Kyle was sitting against the wall opposite. Mirroring, she noticed the position Asta had been in. His eyes were open and his face was calm, with the specific calm of someone who has run out of things to decide. She went to him. She sat beside him. She put her hands on him, not because she could stop it, not because the antidote had left any margin, but because she was a healer and healing was what she was made for, and she was not going to sit beside a dying man and keep her hands in her lap. He looked at her. "You're not going to save me," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you don't get to be alone." Something moved through his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not gratitude, older than gratitude, simpler. The thing that people feel when they are finally truly seen. "The hawks," he said. His voice was thickening. "You said they nested on the north ridge." She blinked. "Yes." I always thought it was the North Ridge. He closed his eyes. I could hear them there. She held his hand. The hawks would be circling now, somewhere over the northern reach, riding the thermals off the granite peaks with that particular careless grace of creatures that have never had to be anything except what they are. She thought he was capable of this. He was capable of this all along. She thought, what a terrible waste. What a terrible human waste. She thought, I forgive him. She thought it clearly and completely and without performance, because there was no one to perform it for, just the two of them and the bare room and the afternoon light coming through the high window. She forgave him. She held his hand. The afternoon moved. She went home with her husband. She did not look back at the northern reach because she had learned that lesson well and learned it early, and she was, above all things, a woman who learned. But she held what had happened there, held it carefully, in the place in herself where she kept the things that had cost her, and she did not discard it. It was part of her story. All of it was part of her story. She was going to carry all of it home and plant it like the seeds her mother had pressed between pages, and she was going to see what grew. The boys were born on a night that could not decide what it wanted. Not stormy, exactly. The volcanic peaks to the west kept storms at bay with their own complicated meteorology. The heat rising off the black stone deflecting weather systems the way a hand deflects a river. Not clear either. The sky above the dark western realm that night was the particularly dense, intimate gray of clouds that are not threatening but are not leaving, clouds that have settled in for the duration the way comfortable visitors do, making themselves at home in the atmospheric middle distance. Inside the mountain palace, Simran was doing the hardest work of her life. Asta had been present from the beginning. The midwife, a broad-handed, unflappable woman named Gerda who had delivered approximately 400 children in the dark western realm and had the serenity of someone who has seen everything and remains professionally impressed by none of it, had suggested, diplomatically, that the king might prefer to wait in the adjoining room. Asta had informed her, politely but with the absolute certainty of a man who has been the final authority in his own palace for 6 years, that he would be staying. Gerda had looked at him. I looked at Simran. Simran had said, from the bed, in a voice that was mostly controlled, he stays. And that had been the end of the discussion. He stayed at her side. His hand in hers or her hand in his, it shifted through the long hours depending on who needed the anchor and who was providing it. He could not see what was happening, but he tracked every sound, every shift in her breathing, every change in the air quality of the room that told him something was progressing or changing or requiring a different calibration of his own internal steadiness. When she needed to squeeze something very hard, she squeezed his hand. He did not flinch. You're crushing my hand, he noted, in the tone of someone reporting a minor weather condition. I know, she managed. It's fine, he said. I have another one. She laughed. Involuntary, painful, and absolutely real, and the laugh helped. The first boy arrived at midnight, announcing himself with the full-throated conviction of someone who has opinions about everything and intends to share them immediately. Gerda placed him in Asta's arms. Simran, exhausted beyond any exhaustion she had previously catalogued, watched her husband receive his son. Asta's hands, large, careful, trained to an extraordinary sensitivity by 4 years of reading the world through touch, moved over the infant with the same thorough attention he gave to everything he needed to understand. The small skull, downy-haired, the weight of the body impossibly dense for something so small, the face. Gerda guided his fingertips, briefly, and he traced the features with a precision so gentle it barely registered as contact. He's angry, Asta said. He'll get over it, Gerda said. He won't, Simran said, from the certainty of already knowing her son. He'll learn to be strategic about it, like his father. Asta turned his face toward her. Something in his expression. She had learned every register of that face, its controlled architecture and the things that moved through it anyway, the involuntary communications that 4 years of armor had not entirely suppressed, was doing something new. Something that had no precedent in the catalog. Hello, he said to his son. Not to the room. Not to the assembled personnel. directly to the small, furious, warm weight in his arms, as if they were being formally introduced, as if the infant was someone whose acquaintance was worth making. "Hello," he said, and his voice was low and private and entirely stripped of every layer that authority had deposited over it. The baby stopped crying. It was probably a coincidence. Gerda would have said so, and she would have been medically correct. But Simran, watching from the bed with her heart entirely outside her body for the first time in her life, thought, "He heard you. Even this small, he heard you." The second boy arrived 40 minutes later, quieter and more observant. He came into the world and immediately went still, looking, insofar as newborns look, at the ceiling with the expression of someone conducting a serious preliminary survey of the territory. "This one is planning something," Gerda said. "Takes after his mother," Asta said. "His mother planned things out of necessity," Simran said. "If he's planning at 40 minutes old, he's doing it for sport." "Then he's mine," Asta said, with the dry, particular satisfaction of a man recognizing a family trait. She laughed again. The second laugh was easier than the first. She thought, "We are going to do this. We are the kind of people who will laugh through the impossible things. We will be all right." She thought, "My mother would have loved this." She held out her arms. They named them in the morning, when the strange gray clouds had finally decided and chosen clearness. The sky above the dark western realm washed pale and high, the hawks already up off the north ridge thermally, the black stone lit to copper and rust in the early horizontal light. Kale, for the older one, who was still strategically angry and seemed to be cataloging grievances in an organized fashion. Rowan, for the younger one, who had spent the night observing. Gerda recorded the names in the palace register with the manner of someone who has recorded many names and intends to record many more and considers each one, without differentiation, worth the ink. Asta sat beside the bed with Rowan in his arms. Kale had been taken briefly by the nursemaid, who was attempting to address the grievances, and Simran watched him. She had spent a year watching him now. A year of cataloging the ways he moved through the world, the ways the world moved through him, the particular architecture of a man who had rebuilt himself entirely from the inside when the outside became unreliable. She had watched him become less fortress and more home, not by demolishing the walls, which were his and which she had never asked him to tear down, but by putting windows in them. Small ones, first, then larger, then the kind you could sit in the sill of and feel the air. "Tell me what you see," he said. It was what he asked her every morning. "What do you see?" The hawks, the light, the color of the basalt in this particular hour. She had learned, over the year, to describe things with a precision she hadn't known she possessed. Not the imprecise language of a person looking and summarizing, but the specific language of someone who understands that description is a gift and gifts deserve craftsmanship. "The sky is very clean," she said. "High and pale, the kind of pale that means the day will be warmer than it looks. The hawks are up, 4 of them, North Ridge, 2 adults and what I think are last season's juveniles trying out the thermal. The stone is copper this morning. The iron veins are catching the light. The main shelf outside the eastern window looks like it's been inlaid." She paused. "And your son is looking at you," she said. "Which one?" "Rowan. He's been looking at you since you picked him up." Asta turned his face toward the infant. He couldn't look back, but he could orient, that homing, that finding, and he did it now, his face turning toward the small weight in his arms with the complete attention of a man who has learned that attention is the most profound thing you can give something you love. "Hello," he said, again, quietly. The infant looked at him with the grave concentration of someone conducting an extended evaluation. "He's deciding," Simran said. "What's he deciding?" "Whether you're trustworthy." A pause. "And," Asta said. She watched her son's face. "I think," she said, "he's going to give you the benefit of the doubt." She thought about her mother that evening. She often did, in the early dark, in the space between the boy's last feeding and actual sleep. A liminal hour that was somehow both the most exhausted and the most alert she felt. Her body too tired for defenses, her mind very clear. She thought about Tori, who had sung to rivers and healed broken things and pressed wildflowers between pages, and given her daughter a gift she hadn't understood was a gift until she needed it. She thought about the sparrow. You gave it to her before you knew she'd need it. She understood now fully what her mother had meant. The healing was the obvious part, the ability to hold a life open, to stand in the gap between a person and their ending and pushback. That was remarkable. She had known it was remarkable since the first time she felt it move through her hands. But the other thing her mother had given her, less obvious and more essential, the capacity to receive. To be in a dark realm at the edge of the world with a difficult, armored, extraordinary man and not need him to be easy. To let things be what they were, hard, slow, worth it, and not contract against the difficulty. To heal not just bodies but situations. To heal by staying. That was the gift. She had carried it across cliffs and carriage roads and 7-day vigils and the long dark of someone else's grief and her own. And she had used it, and it had cost her, and it was inexhaustible. Thank you, she thought. Not to Thorn, who had not deserved her mother. Not to the goddess, who seemed like an entity best addressed in matters of weather. To her mother, directly, in the way of people who believe that love persists beyond the body that contained it. Thank you. I know how to do this now. I'll teach them. She did teach them. She taught Kale, who was indeed strategic and passionate and expressed his feelings at considerable volume, how to feel the truth of a thing and say it, not as a weapon but as an offering. She taught him that strength and honesty were not the same as cruelty, and that the difference was worth learning early. He was, as he grew, her husband's son in the architecture of him, certain and still and capable of holding his ground against considerable pressure, but he laughed like no one in either of their families, a whole-body laugh that arrived without warning and transformed his face, and she thought, that's yours. That's entirely yours. I have no idea where that came from and I love it. She taught Rowan, who had been conducting his evaluation of the world since birth and showed no signs of concluding it, how to look at things from multiple angles before deciding what they were. She taught him her mother's herb catalog and her own extended notes, and he learned with a thoroughness that exceeded hers, asking questions she couldn't answer and going to find the answers himself. He was going to be a scholar, she thought, or a strategist, or something that had no name yet. He was going to be someone the world would not have vocabulary for until he'd been in it long enough to make them coin new words. Asta taught them to listen. This was, she thought, watching him with them, patient, precise,